Good evening. Welcome back to my channel Literati. Today I will sum up the Act 2 of Dr. Faustus. I have already discussed Scene 1 and Scene 2 of Act 2. In Act 1 there were 4 scenes. In Act 2 there are 3 scenes. One of the reasons is that though the English dramatists had adapted to the 5-act formula of the Greek classical drama, the originality of genius or thought or the way their perception was, the number of scenes in each act is not uniform. So one act might have more scenes than the other acts. In Act 1 there are 4 scenes. The last scene is a comic scene. In Act 2 there are 3 scenes and the last scene is a comic scene. We have already discussed, or rather I have already discussed or analyzed the first 2 scenes of Act 2. In Act 1, we had seen Dr. Faustus emerging on his journey to, or beginning his journey to damnation. The reasons they are the comic scenes which round off the Act 1 and Act 2 is that the emotional tension of the idea of sin and temptation and sin and damnation, a very Christian belief which comes directly from the miracles and the moralities and the religious drama, must have been a very emotionally draining experience for the audience. The comic scenes, which are basically burlesque and very slapstick comedy in a very crude form, were meant to dispel the tension, the gloom, and the emotional intensity of the main scenes. In the first 3 scenes of Act 1, we have witnessed Dr. Faustus, the great scholar, beginning his journey towards damnation, his encounter with the powers of hell, his inverted values when for him what is hell becomes heavenly, and the necromantic books which he calls heavenly, and then he welcomes the tools which take him forward towards hell, as the 2 magicians, Valdez and Cornelius, as blessing him with their sage conference. All this is obvious in the first 3 scenes. And we have also witnessed how the Renaissance spirit, the euphoria, the high expectations from themselves, the feeling of enthusiasm, the desire, the ambition to conquer the world, the awareness of the immense possibilities of the horizons which were ready to be conquered. This was a Renaissance feeling which had come in after the darkness of the medieval ages. And Dr. Faustus exhibits this Renaissance feeling in a very eloquent manner. And it also has the elements of the Greek drama in the presence of the chorus and the religious element in the idea itself, the central theme of temptation, sin and damnation, and also the presence of certain elements like the good angel and the bad angel. It has the Renaissance spirit, as already discussed. It is a very modern play in the sense that Marlowe's conception of hell is that of not a place with physical dimensions, but a mental state, a continuous and ongoing agony of the soul, of the mind, of emotions, and of course the persona of Mephistopheles, who is not a symbol merely, but is presented as someone who has different dimensions of a suffering soul. All this is very clear in the first 3 scenes of Act 1, and the 3rd scene ends with Marlowe again expressing his ambition and his confidence and his wish to conquer the world. The last scene, scene 4, is the comic scene, rounding off the action in a very burlesque manner, sort of to create the or lighten the mood. In Act 2, we see in Scene 1, Marlowe presents Dr. Faustus not as the same person he was in Act 1, but a visibly shaken persona, a visibly shaken character who has lost some of that confidence, which was bordering on overconfidence, and is decidedly subdued. He is filled with doubt and uncertainty, and his hell has already begun because he has entered this hell where gradually his mental torture and his agony will intensify. And not only that, but we will see him diminish in size. So, in the very first scene of Act 2, the same man who had devised the medicines, or he had the formulas to cure people, now says that he will offer the lukewarm blood of newborn babies to the altar of evil. So the deterioration in his character is very obvious. Again, in these two scenes, we see Mephistopheles not only as someone who is evil but a suffering soul. Again, the definition of hell as a constant presence within the soul, a constant and never-ending torture. Faustus's unwillingness to heed the warnings, the presence of the good angels and the bad angels, and Faustus finally signing away his soul. And again, the aside by Mephistopheles, which says that he would do anything to obtain his soul. The intense passion is almost unbearable in scene 2, when Marlowe presents Faustus again as someone who swings from one extreme to another. And in desperation, in this scene, for the first time, he calls out to Christ. In this scene, the good angel and the evil angel, who are a part of the tools of the religious drama, and some critics say, in a modern interpretation, the voices of the conflict which is going on in Faustus's soul, appear not once but twice in scene 2 of Act 2. And in fact, Faustus is almost on the point of recanting and turning back to God. And we can imagine the breathlessness of the audience, the Elizabethan age audience, to whom these ideas of hell and heaven and sin and damnation were realities. They were part of their belief system. But as Faustus once more tragically loses the resolution which he had urged upon himself, he lacks the willpower, he lacks the courage, he does not have enough faith. That is again his sin. He puts his faith in the wrong things, in ambition, and once more turning back to evil, he reasserts his allegiance to evil with an exaggerated image, saying that almost trying to prove his loyalty to evil, because at this point of time, not only Mephistopheles, but Lucifer and Beelzebub, the unholy trinity, appear. And not only that, we also witness a reversal of roles and the power equation between Faustus and Mephistopheles. Earlier, in his, we can say, in his inexperience, when he had not bargained on the agony he was assigning for himself, he had boasted that he could command the powers of evil, and his powers, the words which he had uttered of black magic, had so much strength in them that Mephistopheles could not disobey his commands. But now we find definitely that the power equation has changed, and Faustus appears like a cowering person who is afraid, and Mephistopheles and the powers of evil dominate over him. he's afraid of them. He cannot disobey them. So rather they not disobeying him, it is Faustus who is completely within their clutches. So his momentary rebellion squashed tragically, he once more turns back to the evil with vengeance and says that he will slay the ministers and burn the scriptures and all kinds of exaggerated claims which ring hollow. And the tragedy of Dr. Faustus has already begun its course. The moment he had aligned himself with evil, he had signed himself for pain and suffering, and that has already begun. And so the impact of Mephistopheles' words that hell is a continuous place where they carry those who are damned, unhappy souls who carry their hell within their cells, seems to ring true. And there is this ominous finality about this particular moment when Faustus loses once more his chance as redemption due to his lack of resolution. Again, ironically, the words "be resolute" which we had heard him speaking constantly in the first act come back to haunt the memory. And then after this intense emotional moment, it is like a movement of the pendulum. Faustus swings from one extreme to another. This scene 2 of Act 2, ends with a rather trite and a rather superficial and a rather grotesque show of 7 deadly sins in their all deformities and their all repulsiveness parading themselves before Faustus. Faustus has no choice but to accept defeat because he does not have the courage. The last scene, once more, is a comic scene, and it shows his servants Wagner and a clown, and they carry on some foolish antics. The only purpose of this comic scene being to underscore the emotional trauma of the first 2 scenes of Act 2. In fact, there is no literary quality about these comic scenes, which are crude and almost bordering on vulgarity, and sometimes the jokes seem to be so absurd that they are ridiculous. And many critics have, of course, deplored the lack of any literary standard in the comic scenes. Unlike the plays of Shakespeare, where even the clowns or some of the comics in some of his plays, particularly Twelfth Night, seem to parody the action and illuminate it, and they seem to have a particularly literary qualities. But this is true of Twelfth Night, where the brilliance of the comic scenes cannot be denied. But in Dr. Faustus, the comic scenes appear absolutely crass and crude and meaningless, the only purpose being to create some kind of laughter and to dispel some of the tension. What is once more remarkable in this particular scene is the presence of the chorus at the end. The chorus, a remnant of the Greek drama, and the element which makes Dr. Faustus a play in transition with a mixture of the Greek tragedy as well as the religious drama and the Renaissance spirit, as well as a very modern conception which is due to Marlowe's genius. The chorus as performs its function, and the function of the chorus in the Greek drama was also to introduce the action and to comment on the action, to remain in the background, but report on everything which has been happening and to create a kind of a perspective. So the chorus at the end of Act 2 tells us about Faustus's exploits, how he seems to be like a restless soul. It almost makes us feel or understand that Faustus is running away from himself. the chorus says that he cannot stay still in one place, and he is constantly transported from one place to another. He is eager to know more and more, as if he is aware that time is running out, and also the fact that he is afraid to be alone with his thoughts. So, see, Act 2 ends with the words of chorus telling us about Faustus's journeys, all that he has been doing, his magical exploits, and how he seems to be driven by some kind of a frenzy. And this is how Act 2 ends. So we have seen Act 1 and Act 2 taking the action forward. Now it seems that Faustus has lost his chance of deliverance, of asking God for forgiveness, and he had reached a critical point in Act 2, but he turned his back on that moment, and he cowered before and he surrendered before the powers of evil. And the next acts, this is a play which is very condensed. The action moves very fast. The scenes are not very long. They are short. A lot of emotional intensity is present in all the scenes which deal with the main action, and we find that the play has a very rapid movement. So with the words of chorus, we now know Faustus, or we rather see him as a man who is running away from himself, who is isolated in his mind and his spirit, but he is afraid to be alone with his own thoughts. So he is like a man who is almost obsessed in seeing more sights, knowing more things. And again, the chorus defines a very, very Renaissance spirit and tells us about how Faustus is now more or less resigned to his fate, but in his heart of hearts he knows, and he is like a man who is possessed, a man who is in a hurry, a man who is in a sort of a frenzy, and a man who is running away from himself. In the next acts, we will see how far Faustus's destiny takes him till he comes finally to the end or the moment of his reckoning. This is the tragedy of Dr. Faustus. Thank you.